did Enlightenment, we did Scientific Revolution, Reformation, Renaissance, Enlightenment, Colonialism, and Romanticism. Now we've got one more, and that's Nationalism. So let's talk about how we get into this particular ism. Okay, so Enlightenment political thought tells us that the individual has naturally endowed rights. Does anybody remember what those rights are?
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Well, life, liberty, and the pursuit of prosperity, or the pursuit of property. But yeah, in America, they've rephrased it as pursuit of happiness, because that's what happiness is, right? Property. Anyway, that's the American interpretation of that. But life, liberty, and property, or the pursuit of prosperity. Those are naturally endowed rights. Those are things that we are born with and that we have, okay? Romanticism also introduced this fourth thing that people have that is naturally given to them, that they're born with, which is a destiny. Everybody has a destiny, a purpose to their life, not just life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, but also a purpose. You also have a destiny in your life. Okay, so when Thomas Hobbes proposed the idea of the Leviathan, you remember that the Leviathan proposes that the state, that a state, a society, is actually a being that's made out of men, that's made out of people, right? And at the head of that is the crown, is the monarch or the leader or the ruler. Okay, so if this being is made out of other individuals, then it is an individual that is made out of other individuals, which means that this being, this society, also has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of prosperity, and it also has a destiny. So this being, your country, also has a right to live, also has a right to be free, also has a right to prosper, and also has a destiny. And that is how we get to nationalism. The individual state has naturally endowed rights to life, liberty, pursuit of property, and a destiny, okay? That idea comes right on the heels of Romanticism, the idea of your country being a being of its own, like England being a she, you know? We defend her, France being a woman, a person that we defend, even though it's actually a society, because it is an individual that's made out of other individuals. So this comes right on the heels of the Napoleonic Wars, which we talked a little bit about on Tuesday. Napoleon had decided to expand. Napoleon came into France when it was at the edge of a people's revolution. The people had taken over, had overthrown the monarchy, and were now taking power, and Napoleon took control of that movement and then moved it across Europe, and basically took over most of Europe, but he couldn't hold it. So there are some legacies that came out of that. First of all, there's continental warfare. There had been warfare before, but when you look at the difference between the wars of Napoleon and the wars of like the Middle Ages, the battlefield shrinks a lot, okay? The battlefields in the medieval wars were much, much smaller and took up much less space. We're talking about wars that stretched across entire continents. And that was the beginning of that. That was the first time that it happened, where a war actually stretched all the way across, where an army could actually stretch all the way from France to Russia. Like that was new. So the idea of continental warfare, that you had to create an army that was able to fight all over your country instead of just defending your major cities. That was something that was new to the Napoleonic Wars. Another thing that came out of that was the idea of nationalism. The reason that Napoleon's men fought for him was because they were French. Vive la France! We are Frenchmen, and we have that destiny to protect. We have the destiny of France to protect. We owe it to France to protect its destiny. Some of my hair is inside my mask, it's bothering me. Anyway, but the other rippling effect of it was that all these European countries got so tangled up fighting with Bonaparte that they could no longer maintain their colonies. Now remember, they have colonies? Remember how, like, over in South America, a lot of these European, in the West Indies, they have colonies they're supposed to be taking care of? Well, they're too busy to take care of their colonies. So when Napoleon is defeated at 1815, there's like this ripple effect that happens. One of the things that happens is that the monarchs all get together and say, we've got to figure out a way to make this not happen again. We've got to make sure that the people can't rise up again. So they get together and they have what's called the Congress of Vienna. And the Congress of Vienna is presided over by people who believe in the power of monarchs, people who believe that kings should be in charge. So the Congress of Vienna is chaired by the Austrian statesman, Clemens von Metternich, who is a very strong monarchist. He believes that the Austrian king should be in charge of things. But it's also participated in by the major conservative powers, the aristocrats, the nobles of each of these major countries. Their goal is to create peace in the fallout of Napoleon's conquest by redrawing all the borders with permanent marker and making sure that everybody's real clear on where those borders are, and making sure that they understand that the king is in charge inside each of these borders. It's important that we respect the monarchy. So Austria, Britain, Russia, and Prussia are the major powers that are there. France is represented by a pro-monarchy force, Talleyrand is his name, who wants to restore the monarchy of France, which he does. But Austria, Britain, Russia, and Prussia are the big powers that are there. Now, I have to tell you something about Prussia. If you don't know a whole lot about Prussia, Prussia is a little bit, do I have Prussia someplace I can get to it? Yeah, I do. Prussia's like up here, okay? Prussia's up here, and it's in between enough things that it was always being attacked when it was young. And so it developed a really good, strong military. So Prussia is famous for its military. So when I say that that Prussia was there, you have to understand that they were there as the military force that was there. The King of Prussia has a very powerful army at his command. So Spain, Portugal, Sweden, and Denmark were also there, and also weighing in on these borders and making sure to protect their own interests. But the powers that were in charge were, Britain, Russia, Austria, Prussia, big powers like that. The idea was restore the monarchy. So the Restoration monarchies were very autocratic. They were very scared that the people would rise up again. So they clamped down hard on the people's rights. And some of these were like Wilhelm II in Germany, or the Prussia, it was Prussia, it wasn't Germany yet, but the Prussian ruler, Wilhelm II, and Spanish ruler, and Fernando VII, these were like autocratic rulers who were going to strip the people of all those rights they thought they had when the armies were marching through. They were suspicious of anything that sounded like constitutionalism. Anybody who wanted the countries to have a constitution and have the power of the monarchy to be checked by that constitution was very scary. So, and another thing that they did was restore their alliances with the church. The churches in their countries became powerful again because the monarchies wanted to reattach themselves to the church. People didn't like that very much. People rebelled against this. And I made this so you couldn't really read it on purpose because I don't want you to get tangled up in the details. But in 1848 to 1849, people all over the place rebelled against these restoration monarchies, okay? So each one of these little red dots is a place where people gathered a small army and rebelled against their leader, okay? In 1 year, 1848. Dang. What basically happened, sort of in a rippling effect, what happened was that the message that the French got across those borders was there's power in people. People who love their country, who have an identity in their own country can rise up and can do anything. And we think you should do it with us, except we're France and you're not. So what you had sort of a reaction to that was, we like where you're going with this, but we want to do it as Englishmen. We like where you're going, but we want to do it as Austrians. We don't want to be French. We want to do this on behalf of Austria or Bavaria or Prussia or Russia or any of those other places. So
on that map, show me what that Prussia is up there now.
Prussia is this blue part up here.
Oh, it's bigger, actually bigger than it was.
Yeah, it was this part here, but in 1848 it starts to sort of grab other places because one of the defining characteristics of Prussia is the way that we protect ourselves is by being more powerful than anybody around us. And so we'll just start, wiping out our neighbors and bringing them in.
So during this year, like revolutions and stuff like that really became the fashion.
Yeah, populist uprisings happened literally all over Europe in 1848 up against this. One of the things that happened was that Karl Marx published a manifesto, the Communist Manifesto in 1848, and that also spread very far, very fast. And his Communist Manifesto basically stated that the classes were dependent on each other, that this inequality before the law, because under Restoration monarchies, nobles didn't face the same penalties as peasants, and that wasn't right. And that the way that industries were shaping up and all that kind of stuff made it so that power was ultimately going to fall into the hands of people if they would just be brave enough to stand up and grab it. So Karl Marx's manifesto goes across like wildfire and helps to spark all these populist movements, but also it's just, there's industrial things that are happening. There's inequality in factories. There are people that are making money while other people are starving to death, and there's illness that's not being treated, and there's inequality before the law, and you can't go back to the feudal system, which is what the Restoration monarchy seemed to think they could do. Like, we could reestablish, remember back when y'all were happy to just starve to death as peasants? We want to go back to that. You can't go back to that, not once this already, you know, this fervor's already swept through. So in 1848, there's all kinds of revolutions. One of them, especially in Germany, that the revolution took on a nationalist idea. The people who were not the nobles, they didn't just want, you know, to be taken care of in their old age, to make equal wages, to make, you know, fair, to be able to live. They also wanted a nation of their own. They also wanted to be able to claim and say, we are part of this country. And the way that they wanted to do it was to create, out of all these tiny little countries, Prussia and Bavaria and all of these, you know, Baden, all these countries in Hanover, to create Germany. And in order to do that, they grabbed onto this romantic idea, this destiny idea of the Volk. V-O-L-K, the Volk. We come from a people that has been here as part of the land, and we are part of a legend that stretches back over the generations, and we have been here all along, and we create from nothing ourselves, and all of this legend around what a German was. And it created this identity that was very nationalistic. German pride, the idea of German independence, German innovation, German strength. It created this very nationalistic idea of Germany among the people. And so when all the other countries were fighting for constitutional law and equality before the law and the right of a landowner to, or a worker to sue his landowner and all of that kind of stuff, Germans, the German people were fighting for German, were fighting to become German. And the powers that be were very smart about that. The King of Prussia and his Prime Minister, Otto von Bismarck, looked at that and went, well, shoot, we can give them that. If that's what they're rising up about, we can give them that. And so they created the first Confederation of Germany. They created a country. Oh, and by the way, Prussia's ruler is going to be in charge of it, just FYI. So the most entrenched monarchist nobles of all of the German kingdoms, with his own military that was stronger than anybody else's military. By the way, he's going to be the king of the new Germany.
Oh, goody.
So that's part of the deal that they made with these. But they also introduced a lot of things that were very, like, social welfare programs. They introduced old age care. They introduced all these things to sort of keep the population from rebelling. So Germany has less of a massive rebellion than a lot of places because they figured out how to appease them early.
Hey, Mindy.
Yeah.
They introduced the Volkswagen.
Yes, they did. And that's where that term comes from, the Volkswagen, the people's car. Yes. That's actually a really good example when you look at it later, like about 50 years later.
Volkstrom.
Yes, the Volkstrom, the idea of this identity of a people that are strong, because so if you are a German, even if you're the lowest ranking German, you're still a higher ranking person than any other European, because you are one of the Volk, you are one of the people of the earth, you are one of the originals, you know. That was part of the identity that they created. And so the Prussian king takes charge of Germany, and Germany becomes its own nation. In the middle of Europe, suddenly, where there were all these fractured kingdoms that didn't really belong to anybody, were looking out for themselves, suddenly, bang, there is a huge country that has its own identity and has its own destiny. Now, that's not settled. Like, they're going to keep fighting because Austria and Prussia don't like each other very much. Bavaria has its own opinions. Bavaria is mostly Catholic and Prussia is mostly Lutheran, so they have a bunch of problems within their borders. But the idea of Germany as a unified idea is not only suddenly becomes present, but also scares the ever-living daylights out of Britain and France and Russia, because they are right smack in the middle of everything. In Italy, this takes on all of these, the same kind of thing happens, all of these little regions that had their own identity, starting with the Piedmont up here, begins to pull together under the idea of a unified Italy. Let's not be a collection of city-states anymore. Let's be a unified Italy once and for all. Piedmont, Naples, Sicily, the Papal States, the Habsburg States, all of them decide that they're going to unite under a single Italy. And in Great Britain, they're having a little trouble because the Scottish and the Welsh, and I know this will surprise anybody who has Scottish or Welsh blood, are stubborn and don't want to call themselves English, and they've never wanted to call themselves English, even though England really wanted them to just go ahead and consider themselves English. The Scottish have a very strong sense of nationalism, and so do the Welsh. And the Irish, who are also very nationalistic, are also starving to death, because this is the time of the famine that swept through Ireland. So in the middle of all of that, England comes up with a way to negotiate with them by confederating them into a single identity, which is the United Kingdom. They still resist. They're going to resist. They're resisting today. Like, they're still not happy with this. And Ireland is actually its own nation today, but the United Kingdom includes Scotland and Wales under this umbrella that is no longer Britain. It's the United Kingdom. So, you know, they get to have their sense of nationalism and still be part of England. So in North America, the way that this nationalism manifests itself is through something called manifest destiny. And I'm going to breeze right past this because you study this way too much already. We're too American-centric anyway. But the idea is, at some point in the late 1830s and early 1840s, people started talking about this collection of states that is the United States with a destiny to spread over the whole continent. And that meant moving people out of the way and taking over territory that belonged to South America and doing whatever was necessary, but spreading over the entire continent from sea to shining sea. And that nationalistic fervor became like something that people could really latch onto, because you were a Kentuckian or you were a Tennessean, but if you were also an American, that meant that you had this destiny to stretch out over a whole continent, even if you never left Kentucky. So that nationalistic fever really took on in America. And later it will continue, because there are two other nations that will form inside those borders that will have very strong nationalistic sentiments. One of them is the nation of Tecumseh, who unites tribes from all across the place into what he calls a nation of indigenous peoples that are all fighting for their independence. That nationalistic fervor will actually catch on amongst indigenous people under Tecumseh. And then it will catch on in the South with this idea of a confederacy, a nationalistic confederacy. So that nationalistic fever sweeps across America and then also sweeps across different regions of America. So the idea that we in our region have our own destiny. Under that definition, would you call Texas nationalistic?
Yeah.
No doubt. The whole class is like, oh yeah. The identity of a Texan, separate from the identity of an American, is very, our person made out of people has a very strong destiny of its own, apparently.
Well, I mean, it's not that
We're
But we're very good at that. But that's a separate class. Anyway, okay. So let's talk about how this affects the colonies. Now that we've got this nationalistic fervor stretching across all of these areas and people turning inward to reshape themselves, what happens to all of those colonies? Okay, so the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, remember you looked at this a little bit when we were talking about colonialism, they don't have the same relationship with Europe that the North American colonies did. They are neglected by the Iberian Peninsula. The people from Spain itself turn their noses up at the people from the American colonies. So a Creole in the South American colonies, and this is as distinct from what you would call a Creole in Louisiana now, because that's a term that got moved. That's a completely different spelling of the word Creole that then got pasted together because Americans don't know how to spell things. But so just set aside what you think of as Creole cooking and Creole whatever. That's not what we're talking about. A Creole is a person who has Spanish parents who were born on the continent of Spain, of Europe, but who themselves were born in America. So they are white people, they are European people, but they were actually physically born in the colonies. So that is a Creole. And the Creole is probably the highest ranking person that you will find in most South American societies, aside from a peninsular, which is a person that's actually born in Spain. The Creole is the class that invents itself on the continent and begins to take power like right away because they inherit it. They're the wealthy landowners, they're the wealthy business owners, they're the people who own everything. And they're also the ones who can command military forces. They gather military forces around themselves. As the colonies are being neglected by the European powers, these Creole people, these people who are landed aristocrats basically, begin to gather forces of protectors, men to protect them. So they begin to build their own little armies, and they become what's called a caudillo, which is a leader who exists above the law. Somebody who has no responsibility to live under the law because he's got his own army. Yes?
Oh, that's what you mean.
Oh, okay. I thought you were raising your hand, sorry. Okay, so most of the European countries appoint somebody to be in charge of these places. And those are called viceroyals. They're members of, they're usually nobility. Sometimes they're even princes. Sometimes they're even high ranking nobility like royalty. But they're appointed specifically to be the monarchy ruler, the representative of the crown of Spain or Portugal in the South American colonies, or France sometimes. That viceroyalty shows up and takes position and takes a rulership position in those colonies, but the caudillos have raised their own private armies in the meantime. So the viceroyalty has to maintain its own strength in order to protect itself from these caudillos. And that's a situation that's happening across several of the colonies. So the reason really that the Latin American colonies declared their independence wasn't because they were Enlightenment thinkers who believed in life, liberty, and property and all that. It was because they were being neglected by the European powers. They had no choice. In order to prosper at all, they had to be independent. They had to shake off these monarchists who weren't really connected and were neglecting them. So we're going to move across several of the countries real quick. So in Brazil, in 1807, to escape from Napoleon, the Portuguese royalty moved to Brazil. Okay, they fled to Brazil. When Napoleon was defeated in 1815, the royalty left Brazil and went back to Portugal, but they left his 5-year-old son in the hands of advisors and stuff in Portugal to make sure that the royalty still had a presence there, because the time that they spent staying in Portugal from 1807 to 1815 revealed to them that there might not be as much respect for the royalty in Brazil as they originally thought, that the connections weren't as strong as they thought they were. So they left, he left Pedro in Brazil specifically to take over the ruling of Portugal. Pedro became an adult in Brazil and declared independence from his own family. He declared himself the emperor of Brazil and declared that Brazil was independent. His people revolted against him. The people of Brazil actually revolted against him, and he ended up fleeing back to, and this is the 5-year-old son. I'm sorry, I mixed up the 5-year-old son and the adult. In 1815, the son that was left behind was an adult. Okay, so I'm sorry, that's my fault. I got ahead of myself. The king the prince that was left behind was an adult. He declared independence from his own father. And then the people rose up against him and he fled back to Portugal, leaving his 5-year-old son in charge. So what forms around that 5-year-old son is a collection, a committee of caudillos, of high-ranking landowners and Creoles who then tell that young king how to rule Brazil. So that's how they declare independence, in stages like that in Brazil. They shake off the monarchy that they have. The monarchy basically flees away from them, and the monarchy that they leave is pretty weak. So they just go, this is a figurehead. We'll just keep this little 5-year-old, we'll keep him out of trouble as he grows up. We'll form an assembly around him. So that's how they become basically independent. They shift from this viceroyal, this boy who was 5 when he was left behind, to a federalist assembly. They also shift a lot of other things that make it possible for them to cut the cords with Europe. One of them is to shift from the growing of sugar to the growing of coffee. Brazil becomes less about the sugar and more about the coffee. Sugar is an intensely slave-heavy cash crop. Like the life expectancy of a slave on a sugar plantation is something like 4 years.
4 or 6.
Yeah, 4 to 6 years when they arrive, from the time they arrive to the time they die, because it's such a dangerous trade, the sugar trade. Coffee is not, because it grows in the mountains, because it grows in a different way. The labor required for coffee is different, and the life expectancy is different. It's not quite as deadly to work on it. So they're able to ease off of their labor requirements, and they're able to use indigenous labor, which was harder when they were growing sugar. So it allows them to gradually separate themselves from the need for that connection with the Portuguese, slave trading industry. The other shift that they make is, so they go from slave labor to immigrant labor. They bring people in to work on coffee plantations instead of trading people to work on sugar plantations. So in Argentina, the Argentina bid for independence actually comes at the hands of a group of fighters who actually were trying to fight for Argentina's independence before Napoleon took power, but weren't really getting very much traction. This man here, Jose de San Martin, was an Argentinian who had gone into the areas of the Andes and had found disgruntled people to build an army out of. And a lot of them were mulattoes, a lot of them were, some of them were actually land-owning black people, and then some of them were just former slaves who had run away. He built an army called the Army of the Andes, and he began to knock over all of the monarchist influences in Argentina. What San Martin wanted was to see all of South America united under one emperor, and then have a constitutional monarchy, have parliaments with representatives and stuff like that. But he wanted all of South America to be a single country, and he wanted all of it to fit under a single monarch, because he wanted a constitutional monarchy. On the other side of that was New Granada. When Fernando VII was that autocratic ruler that came into Spain during that wave of restoration monarchies, he was the one from Spain, and he wanted to reestablish control of his colonies. He wanted to make sure that Spain was benefiting from their colonies. So he sent forces into New Granada specifically for the reason of overthrowing what he saw were Creoles who'd gotten too powerful. But the problem with that was that the Creoles had gotten too powerful. So when he sent his forces in, they met these juntas that were already in place, these military forces that were already in place. And each one of these little places has their own little constitution. So each one of these little urban centers has Creole and Caudillos in charge with their own armies and their own constitutions. They've already written their own documentation. So the King of Spain realizes pretty quickly that the viceroy is not going to be able to have any power. This man, Simon Bolivar, is an Enlightenment thinker. He actually does subscribe to all of those ideas, because he's actually spent time in France. He's actually spent time over there learning, sitting in the salon and discussing the philosophies. And he was actually present at the coronation of Napoleon and saw the laurel wreath on Napoleon's head. He actually saw all of that. And he recognized that this was an opportunity for New Granada to be free, because what was going to happen with Napoleon was going to provide the opportunity for New Granada to be free. So Simon Bolivar began to speak openly about how the rights of the people of New Granada were being violated, and so he was banished to Jamaica, where he raised an army and then came back. He came back to New Granada with his own army and began to fight all of the viceroyalty that was placed there. He also believed in bringing together the people, but he didn't believe that there was any possibility that they could unite all of South America under a single government. He wanted to go ahead and leave the systems of government that were there and form a strong confederacy, a confederation of governments where each individual state would agree to work together in a large confederation. That was Simon Bolivar. So you're going to read, I'm echoing, you're going to read in your documentation this week a letter that Simon Bolivar wrote explaining his point of view on this, exactly why it was not going to be possible. Let me get that up here. I already have it up.
Hey, Mindy,
Yes.
Mindy, you notice in all of the paintings, those fellows are wearing very high-necked garments, and that had a practical purpose. It protected them from saber cuts. And that's where the U.S. Marines got the name leathernecks, because they wore a similar apparel to protect themselves from saber cuts.
You're talking about this? These high starched collars?
Yeah.
You mean those aren't to protect them against vampires? Well, that's disappointing. They're multi-purpose, yes. Yeah, and the gentlemen wore them too, which is interesting because you can, whenever you see a practical military thing come through, there's a wave of fashion afterwards where it makes it into the civilian population. So gentlemen are wearing them high and starched and really protective like that at the same time, even though there's no practical reason for them to. It's weird. Anyway, so this is a document that y'all are going to look at today. You're going to look at Simon Bolivar's letter, the Jamaica letter. And this is a letter that is going to detail exactly why he believes that he wants to bring his Enlightenment ideas into the area, but he also wants to stop any talk of uniting the entire continent under a single monarch. So I want you to take a look of that at that, because some of these people didn't just want to unite all of South America. They actually wanted to unite with North America too, and bring North America into this constitutional monarchy. So, they actually believed there was a possibility that they could, invade up north and bring the United States into that constitutional monarchy and unite all of the Americas under a single thing. And that seems a little unlikely. So that's what you're going to read tonight. There is a lot of comparison between this Bolivar letter, and you can see by taking a look at that and taking a look at some of the language of common sense, that these are Enlightenment thinkers who all came from the same ideas. But these are all people that are being affected by the same ideas. So that's a good thing to take a look at. So San Martin wanted a constitutional monarchy, and Bolivar wanted a confederation of oligarchic republics. Bolivar was looking at the Caudillo leadership that was already there. They was looking at the juntas that were already there, the militaries that were already there. And he believed that those could be convinced to form their own little countries and then confederate all of those countries together. He did not want another constitutional monarch. He did not want another monarch to be in charge. But San Martin believed that that was the best way to bring everybody together, was through a benevolent monarch who would unite all of South America under a single one. They met in 1822. They had a meeting and they exchanged ideas. And at the end of that meeting, not at the end of that meeting, but at the end of that relationship where they were discussing these ideas with each other, San Martin retired. He realized that there was no way he was ever going to make this happen, and he just retired from the military.
Hey,
So,
Mindy.
Yeah.
It's interesting that Bolivar doesn't include Bolivia in that drawing.
Well, I think that was named after him.
Okay.
That was after his time. But so for most of the areas of South America, what we end up with is newly independent Latin American countries that coalesce under strong individuals. So you end up with oligarchies. Y'all know what an oligarchy is? Yeah? Tell me what an oligarchy is.
It's a small group of people that lead the nation as kind of a committee.
Specifically, what kind of people?
Usually like aristocrats, rich people, businessmen that can.
Yeah, businessmen. What's another situation? Like where in America do we have groups of businessmen who use their strength to rule various areas? Huh?
Wall Street.
Wall Street? Okay.
Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley.
Silicon Valley. How about the mafia?
Washington.
How about the mafia?
You know what,
Let's talk for a minute about the different branches of the mafia and different. This is where
illegal.
does that make them any less influential?
The government doesn't like competition.
Well, an oligarchy is a collection of wealthy people with their own militaristic forces that are able to therefore make decisions for everybody else. So an oligarchy, a government that's organized around oligarchy, it's always going to be the wealthy who are making the decision for everybody else. And that's mostly what we end up with because it's the natural progression. Landowners become businessmen, become heads of industry, and they always coalesce this group of strength around them. And then they overthrow any attempt to impose any kind of more egalitarian rule. So most of the South American countries after the 1800s are going to end up with strongmen, that's a one-word thing because they're not always men, but a strong person, oligarchic rule inside their countries. We have just enough time to sort of visit Mexico and talk about Mexico a little bit, but if you're really interested in the whole Mexican history, we have a teacher whose job that is. So like you can learn a lot about Mexico by taking classes from Dr. Perry. But I will say that remember that Mexico had sort of a unique position and a unique situation in that as one of the earliest places where the Spaniards actually set up their whole class system, Mexico actually, because when Cortez took over the region controlled by the Aztecs, they already had a nobility, they already had branches, they already had a tributary empire. So when Spain took over Mexico, it maintained that, it held on to it. So Mexico has all of its power pointed at the top already. So when they're declaring independence is very complicated because while Spain has been neglectful of most of its colonies, the royalty of New Spain, of Mexico, is actually very closely connected to the royalty of Old Spain. So it's a little bit different. Their fight for independence is a little bit different, but they do actually rise up and fight for independence because they are being neglected during the end of the Napoleonic Wars. So from 1815 is when Napoleon's defeated. In 1813, Mexican forces rise up and start to try to overthrow Napoleon, or try to overthrow Spain. They fight these wars from 1813 to 1821. When they win, they establish a country under a specific caudillo by the name of, anybody want to hazard a guess? You're going to hit yourselves on the head as soon as I say it.
Santa Anna.
Thank you, Sam. Yes, Santa Anna. They establish a country that's under a very strong militaristic presence, which is Santa Anna. So, I'm sorry. Oh, okay. All right, if you say so. I do this whole thing where I talk about Santa Anna in my cultural history of Texas class because he's just fascinating to me how he gets to where he is, because he bounces from one side of a conflict to another quite a bit throughout. I mean, he's like pro-monarchy until the monarchy begins to fall, and then he is pro-not monarchy because now is the time to seize power. And he does that back and forth quite a bit.
He's always on the side of the winner.
Huh?
He's always on the side of the winner.
Weird, miraculously, no, once he wasn't. There's one particular time when he was definitely not on the side of the winner.
He tried to hide with the soldiers.
Yes, no, the reason that he has a reputation of being a coward is because when, after the Battle of San Jacinto, in order for him to be arrested, he had to be revealed because he was hiding as a common soldier among the wounded. And his own soldiers were like, that's him.
The Yellow Rose. Yellow Rose.
It's you. And he's like, stop. So, you know, well, anyway.
The Yellow Rose of Texas came out of that.
Yes, the seduction of Santa Anna by the, yes, it's all very fascinating to me, and I love to study it. But Santa Anna lost that battle because he was busy. Bless her heart. Anyway. So Santa Anna, because of the war debts that Mexico fighting against America for the possession of the southern territories of North America, California and Texas, they go into great debt. And as a result of those debts, they're vulnerable to the Europeans. So the president of Mexico, Juarez, establishes a relationship again with Europe. He has a fairly liberal constitution. He tries to impose this very liberal constitution, but he's also very susceptible to he's vulnerable to the Europeans because his country is in so much debt. So France actually manages to reestablish control of Mexico for a little while and imposes a new emperor of Mexico, Maximilian I. This French imposed emperor doesn't rule for very long. He's overthrown in 1867. We don't pay very much attention to that because in 1867, we just finished studying the Civil War. So we're not really paying attention to much of what's going on in Mexico. But the truth is that they have uprisings and downfalls all throughout this history. As a matter of fact, they are still having Mexican revolutions into, you know, the 20th century that are affecting life in the southern states of North America too. So Mexican independence is something that you're never done studying, really, because they're so deeply entangled with their roots that they actually have trouble separating themselves out. So at the end of this, what we have are several independent countries in Latin America. We have an independent North America that has a very strong sense of nationalism. We have independent countries in Europe that have a very strong sense of nationalism, and nationalist identity is starting to define not just what it is that they think about themselves, but what they're going to do in the future. Because each one of these countries believes that it has a destiny. Each one of these countries believes that it's not just enough to sit inside your borders and be who you are. You're supposed to grow and have a destiny. So if all of these countries with this nationalistic fervor are all deciding at the same time that they need to be growing and having a destiny, what's going to happen? You think? At some point, they're going to get to where their interactions are actually becoming toxic with each other. They already are. I mean, they're already from the beginning, they already are. Say again?
Start rubbing each other the wrong way.
Yeah, exactly. This is going to be friction. So we'll get into how this, you know, sort of puts us in a position to actually face off against each other in World War. But first, we really need to check in on Asia. Because we kind of left them on their own. While we were studying all of these ideologies, we kind of left Asia on its own. So next week we'll be talking about Imperial China and Imperial Japan, and we'll be talking about what's going on with them, because it has an effect on all of this. But also, this is an opportunity for y'all, because most of your countries are now interacting with each other. So whatever country it is that you're assigned, take a look at it and see how, you know, these interactions affect it. Any questions about any of this stuff? I talk way too fast. I'm sorry. I talk so fast that I'm like, oh, I'm done.
What
Oops.
about the villa guy on the wanted post?
Oh, Pancho Villa?
Yeah, what did Pancho do?
Pancho Villa raised an army to overthrow the powers that be in Mexico. And
Did some cross-raid borders.
yeah, he kind of came across the southern borders into Texas and into Arizona for some of that. And that was fun. He at the beginning of the 1850s or so, when Texas was newly independent from Mexico, there were still a lot of Mexicans living in Texas and in those southern states, in California. So when they were trying to raise a force to overthrow the government that was in Mexico, they recruited from inside the southern states. And so, I don't know, there were some movements that were very pro Pancho Villa and some movements that were very against. My point of this was to say that the Mexican movement for independence was not settled, that they were continuing to overthrow their own leaders and impose new leaders and overthrow those leaders and impose new leaders throughout like the 20th century. They're still doing that. So
Don't have another revolution.
there's actually a reason for that, which I teach in this other class, and that is that there's a three-stage process to having a revolution in Mexican society, in the specifically in the Creole society. There's a grievance, like throwing down a glove, and then there's a committee that meets, and then there's a war that happens. Like, that's something that happens, and it's kind of hard to stop once you start. Once you've thrown, because there's a lot of pride involved. Once you've thrown down a gauntlet and declared a grievance, you can't really just meet and settle your grievance. You got to have a fight, you know? Huh?
Mexico still has a lot of pride. It's not machismo.
Well, it's and some of that is based in its roots, and some of it is based in cultural identity, and some of that is just our perception of it because we don't see it in ourselves. So
Okay, like what's his name? El Chapo.
he
was bearing money all over, they said, to Texas. I mean, millions and millions of dollars that they've been finding, that they believe he really penetrated deeper than Texas with his money, and don't nobody know where it is.
Yeah, that's more of a gangster kind of situation too. That whole situation was.
That's more of a,
Yeah, that's a gangster kind of situation. El Chapo. Yeah. Okay, so any other questions about, anyway, y'all have a pretty good grasp on nationalism, you think? You have a pretty good idea of why that's a thing? Because that's really what you need to get out of this, is we can always go back and remind ourselves later where the countries are and who's in charge of them, but you gotta get these big ideas. You gotta get the idea of individual rights and liberty and identity and nationalism. That part's really important. Okay, no questions? All right, your assignment for tonight is to take a look at the Bolivar letter, and I will liberate the assignment so that you can see it. Is to take a look at the Bolivar letter and answer the question, what reasons does Bolivar give for not believing that all of South America can be consolidated? This is also a grammar exercise. Most of your assignments from here on are going to have a grammar component. And that's because while I love you and I value you, I want to give you these skills. So you may not in your answer use personal pronouns, because this is where it's going to be most tempting to do it. You're going to say we and they when you're referring to North America or Mexico or South America, excuse me, when you're talking about Bolivar's point of view versus North American point of view, because the question is, what reasons does Bolivar give for believing that all of South America can be consolidated into a single country? Did North America have the same problems? Why was it different? You know, some of the problems that Bolivar lists specifically, do those also exist in North America? Do those prevent us from being a single? Oh, I said us. You see how easy it is to fall into that trap, but you are history writers, and history writers do not do that. History writers don't say I, we, our, us. History writers speak of, they speak of entities that are outside of themselves. And you also don't say, in my opinion, or I believe, or I think, because it's your paper and we already know it. We know this is your opinion. This is your paper. Guess who wrote it? You. So you don't have to say that anymore. So breaking that habit of saying us when you're talking about America and them when you're not, or talking about in my opinion, or I think, or I believe, that's going to be a part of this assignment. So I will dot the point if I find any evidence of first person pronouns in your answer to this. But other than that, it's exactly the same as all the other ones. It's just a paragraph. It's your opinion. Just avoid these things. Okay. Any questions?
Would you say that the previous assignments that we talked, there's not a lot of that?
No, there's not been a lot of that. Oh, no, has there been a lot of people not doing that right?
Yes.
Yeah. It's time for us to start focusing on our, because by the end of the semester, my goal is by the end of the semester that you will have some of the, that's why each of your research papers has a couple of grammatical elements that I'm specifically looking for. So by the end, the time you write that last paper, you've got command of all of these things, and what you present me with is a good academic historical paper. Like that's the goal. That's the dream, is to do that. So that's why in your world stage project, like the foundations essay also had a guide on proper sentences. You're going to use that plus the verbs and passive voice when you write your next one, but also these little activities where we just, you know, try to break a little bad habit at a time. Like don't use personal pronouns. Don't use contractions. Do not use contractions, I should say, because don't use a contraction. It's so easy to accidentally do it, but in good historical academic writing, you don't do it. So, any questions? I have absolute faith. I don't think y'all will have any problem at all.